Trump wants to end Ukraine war. He seems to be willing, is at least on one occasion said he's willing to take NATO expansionism off the table in terms of Ukraine, and that is the key thing to solve this crisis. It's insane what's happening in Europe now, and this is not healthy. And you can't look at what's happening in Europe now if you don't see it in the context of the overwhelming U.S. influence. So the consequence: Europe is losing relevance. It's becoming subordinated, and the only world we kind of known since World War II was to live under U.S. protection. So we hurried under the U.S. umbrella again and surrendered a lot of the geoeconomic and political autonomy which the Europeans have been building up. If you want an extreme example, look at Nord Stream. Everyone knows the United States blew this up, and the Germans have to stand there and smile and make excuses for for the ones who did it. I mean, it's a huge case of Stockholm syndrome. Trump is a bit of a wild card. He can say one thing and he might mean it, but how he's going to implement it is not really clear. But what is clear is that Trump is seemingly very interested to end the Ukraine war. And this is also evident by his pick of Vance as his VP, who's also calling this a loss for the United States. But it's not clear what he will do if he doesn't get the peace he wants. And it's important to also interpret what Trump is for, because he's not against American empire. His main concern is there's no return on investment. It's not sustainable. This is why he's always very worried that America's allies is taking it for a sucker. So we're taking all security dependent. We're taking the security guarantees, but we're not giving anything back. This is his main concern. An empire should be able to make money of its empire. Ukraine is losing investment. They're not. It's costing America billions of dollars, and you can't really defeat Russia. No one even defined what victory over the world's largest nuclear power would actually mean, especially when Russia considers this to be an existential threat. So the whole thing is has been silly, and this is quite obvious. This is why for 2.5 years in the West we haven't talked about what victory means. And unfortunately for China, he probably would like to focus some of this against the Chinese instead, as being the main rival of the US. Hopefully he's pursuing industrial policies and subsidies and all, but and not pursuing militarizing the economic disputes. But that's not a certainty thing either. So Trump wants to end Ukraine war. He seems to be willing, is at least on one occasion said he's willing to take NATO expansionism off the table in terms of Ukraine, and that is the key thing to solve this crisis. Of course, now we have territorial disputes too, but that is the source of the war. But it's unclear whether or not he's going to be willing to make these territorial concessions, because Trump sells himself as the great deal maker. What if he gets a poor deal from the Russians? And he will get a bad deal, because Russia will not trust anything that America signs. So if he doesn't get a good deal, what will he do then? That's not clear. Is he going to get his peace in 24 hours? I really doubt it. And if so, he's going to have to use huge pressure, which will maybe even just escalate the conflict. So I think, it would, but it's much better promise than the Kamala Harris presidency, I guess. So, but while I would see Trump very optimistically in terms of ending the Ukraine war, on other conflicts, be it the Israel-Palestine conflict, I think this is bipartisan consensus. They're all not pro-genocide necessarily, but they're all pro unconditional support for Israel. And the same goes for China as well. I think both the Democrats and the Republicans are quite hostile to China. So again, keep in mind that all the things Trump did, all the policies towards China, all of them were kept under Joe Biden. So I don't think that much will change based on who sits on the throne. But the one exception, of course, is Ukraine. That's the one really divisive issue in American politics. I think it will be look back at a historical mistake, how we pushed the Russians out of Europe. Before 2022, we saw the Germans, the French. What were they saying? They're saying, "Listen, we can't have too many sanctions on the Russians because we're going to push them out of Europe and into the hands of China, and this will be a huge loss for the West." And the Russians could diversify who they supply their energy to, but we in Europe would not be able to diversify who we source new energy from. So now we have less reliable and more expensive energy, which is why our industries are becoming less and less competitive. As a European, I'm not happy to see this. We're just becoming more and more dependent on the US. If you want an extreme example, look at Nord Stream. Everyone knows the United States blew this up. Even, they would try to blame it on the Russians, but even the Americans are saying it wasn't the Russians, which meant it's either the Ukrainians or the Americans. And if it was the Ukrainians, which I don't think it was, they wouldn't have done it without the green light or the knowledge of America or participation. So they blew up the main gas pipelines we had, sustaining our industries, and the Germans have to stand there and smile and make excuses for the ones who did it. I mean, it's a huge case of Stockholm syndrome. 3 years ago, I published a book. It was called "Europe as the Western Peninsula of Greater Eurasia," and one of the key arguments was how Europe would have to transition from the unipolar order to the multipolar order if it wanted to remain its relevance. When once you have as many other centers of power, the Europeans would have to adjust their policy in order to remain relevant. And the most important thing, again, is diversify. The Europeans need diversification, just as we spoke about the Russians need. They need to have connections with Russia. They need to have connections with China and the US. And this is a key component if you want to have also maintain proper political autonomy. And what we've seen is the Europeans have been abandoning it. We're behaving as if it's still the 90s. So we are prioritizing relations with the US. So the Americans, of course, they have an interest because they would like for Europe to cut itself away from other centers of power. And in Europe, we're very obediently doing it. They say, cut yourself off Russia. Okay, cut yourself off China. And many Europeans are doing this. But what would happen then? Well, we would become excessively dependent on the United States. We would not have the same economic efficiency, prosperity, so we become poor, more dependent on the US, less able to actually pursue our national interest, and you would see Europe over time become less and less relevant. And this is our failure to transition from unipolarity to multipolarity. And the only world we kind of known since World War II was to live under US protection. So we hurried under the US umbrella again and surrendered a lot of the geoeconomic and political autonomy, which the Europeans have been building up. Now, so what we see now is political independence has been largely lost. As you know, the United States also finance a lot of this. They call it non-governmental organizations, but they're really funded by the government, and they're often staffed by people with close ties or even background from the intelligence community. So this is a way of manipulating civil society of other states. Now, whenever countries, be it Georgia or anyone else, pursues laws to limit the power of these so-called NGOs, we punish it. Instead, we should be looking at emulating it. We shouldn't allow foreign powers to try to hijack our civil society. This is unacceptable. And what happens when you're not able to protect your national interest anymore? You're going to have legitimacy crisis. You're going to have political crisis. And this is what we see. We see political leaders can be changed, but the policies can't be changed. And this is why you have more and more economic problems across Europe. You will have more and more political upheaval, riots, and the Europeans now become quite extreme. Look at the EU today. It was considered a peace project. Every time there was conflicts around the world, what would the EU do? They would say, listen, stop the fighting, let's have a ceasefire, sit down and talk to each other. We might not agree today, but let's start the talking. In Ukraine, we essentially criminalized negotiations and diplomacy. When countries like Hungary, which actually has the rotating presidency of the EU, they went to China, Russia, Ukraine, trying to facilitate. The EU responded by punishing it because you don't talk to your adversaries. This is what the new foreign policy chief of the EU is actually saying. We don't talk to Russia because they're war criminals, so we can't talk to them. This is insane what's happening in Europe now, and this is not healthy. And you can't look at what's happening in Europe now if you don't see it in the context of the overwhelming U.S. influence. So the consequence: Europe is losing relevance. It's becoming subordinated. There's not all bad things about the United States, but everything is. There's dilemmas. Yeah, we should have America as a close friend. They should have a place in Europe. But this subordination is just really, really breaking Europe, I think. And as we're falling, and Europe is in decline now, some will break free. And you see this: Hungary, Slovakia, Italy. Those who will seek to protect their national interests will have to start to gradually break a little bit free. But then Europe loses its collective bargaining power. So there's no good solutions going forward unless, again, we diversify. And then we need China, we need Russia. But this is not going to happen. The main concern often in Europe is that China is, we say, undermining EU solidarity by picking out nation states, but instead setting up bilateral partnerships. But this is also, it's not completely fair to put this on China, because China will advance its own economic interest. And if the EU is aligning with the US in order to put all these draconian tariffs and push back against China, which goes against the national interest of its member states, why wouldn't these member states reach out directly? That's, again, what the Hungarians have done. This is what the Italians are now doing. This is a problem of regionalism. If you want this regional institution, it has to be able to deliver actual goods to its member states. I really think that a key problem is one thing that's struggling in the US, and I guess collective West, is the lack of political imagination. It's very hard for us to imagine a world where China would not just be equal, but be more powerful. It's because after the Cold War, we had this thesis of the end of history. The assumption was, the world would be aligning under the West. As America said, we are now the leader of the world, as Bush said in '92, and the world would align under liberal democratic ideals, under American leadership, and this would be the liberal peace, if you will. Now this is falling very quickly apart, and so I don't think there's any political imagination of how to treat countries like not just China but Russia as equals. It's very difficult. If we had been able to do that, I don't think we would have these conflicts at the moment. If you criticize the excesses of liberalism in Europe these days, you are seen as some crazy far right, or very nasty labels will be given to you. Yeah, I wrote a tweet about the opening show, and it got almost like 400,000 views or something, because it was I think it shocked a lot of people, and it kind of shows the duality, because liberalism is based on two ideas which contradict each other. One is always tolerance, but the other is the assumption of universalism, that we'll all go towards the same progressive ideas. And so that's why you see often the contradictions. Like, why would they mock Christianity in this way by comparing the Last Supper with some drag show and this blue Smurf? I don't know even. Yeah, anyway, so sexualized Smurf. Well, what's the point of this? And I think that's the point. There's very little tolerance, for example, towards Christians. This is because there's assumed that this kind of communitarian ideas would be abandoned. And this is a long discussion ever since the French Revolution. Because when the French Revolution was introduced, it came with nationalism, but also democracy. And this was the liberal nation state. Now, many have assumed that for liberalism to really work, it has to decouple itself from nationalism. By decoupling liberalism from nationalism, or the spirit of religion, as the Tocqueville would say, the liberalism, like a flower, would cut off its own roots and it would die. And this is what I'm seeing, which is why liberalism today is not very liberal at all. It's hate against Christians. It's just a huge animosity towards anyone who doesn't conform to these new principles. So it's very strange, unfortunate time for liberalism, and very little efforts I see now to really reflect on what is going wrong. liberalism, before it became an ideology or almost a religion in the West under neoliberalism, there were always recognition of some of the problems. Liberalism then is putting the individual first. But keep in mind that how liberalism thrived in the West, it was the liberal nation state. So the nation state is a conservative concept because it promotes a communitarian identity. So, you have a people, a common history, common culture, common language, common faith, and this is kind of what you build the collective consciousness on. And within that space, we carved out a good space for the individual, for liberalism to thrive. And the problem, I think, which we've seen over the past few decades now, is that liberalism has begun to divorce itself from the nation state. So we can't have a national culture. We're going to have to have multiculture. Also have radical secularism. We begin to abandon a lot of the collective. And if you look back at when a Frenchman, if you will, Alexis de Tocqueville in the early 19th century, he went to visit the United States to see how did liberalism work in the US. Well, what made it work? And one of his main conclusions was that the spirit of liberty, that is of the individual, was always balanced by the spirit of what they called then religion, which was then the communitarian, the collective, which tied things together, and also had a moral foundation, which everything wasn't about the self. And he said with this balance, it would work. But he said over time, it's in the nature of liberalism to become more free, to free itself from all external constraints. But then it means that the individual decouples itself from the state. It doesn't accept authority from the family, from the father, from the teacher. So across the board. And what is an individual which only identifies based on yourself and not the communitarian identities? It's narcissism and nihilism. And this is one of the plagues we really have as countries undergo, be it industrial revolution, globalization, pursue more individual rights. This is all fine and well, but it has to be rooted or balanced by the communitarian, which is why, for example, if you look towards China, when they now developing their economy fast, more liberal than it's been before, what at the same time, it's also trying to strengthen, thousands of years of history, its national culture, and this is what it has to do. It has to have an anchor in the more perpetual, and I think that's something that we lost sight of in the West by glorifying the individual and forgetting about communitarian ideas, and it goes against a lot of the early literature on liberalism.
朋友都知道我是很挑剔的，防晒乳我选 KISS 皇家呵护抗光清爽高防晒凝露，因为它有媲美蓝光神盾的抓藻植萃，保护我在阳光下延缓肌肤老化，维持青春弹力，可以防御工作环境里的3C 商品，各种光源对肌肤的伤害，擦起来清爽不黏腻。我特别喜欢它做到海洋友善。365天，天天抗光抗老化，是我的保养日常。你呢？呵护您，呵护全家人，专属你的 KISS Royal Care 抗光清爽高防晒凝露。